Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you might be joining us. And thank you for joining us here today. We'll go ahead and get things started. My name is David Dixon. I'm a meteorologist and TV engagement coordinator with the nonprofit Covering Climate Now. For those of you that might be new to Covering Climate Now, we are a global collaboration of more than 500 newsrooms across 60 countries all across the world. We're organized by journalists for journalists to help us all do a better job of covering the defining story of our time, climate change and its local impacts. Go ahead and head to our website, coveringclimatenow.org, to learn more, as well as to sign up for our newsletters, newsroom trainings, and much more, all of which is completely free of charge. I am thrilled to be joined today by a fellow meteorologist and colleague who's going to help us moderate today's exciting session. Over to you, Shel.
Yeah, thanks, David. Howdy, friends. My name is Shel Winkley. I'm a meteorologist as well as the weather and climate engagement specialist here at Climate Central. If you're unfamiliar with us, we are a nonprofit, non-advocacy organization of scientists and communicators dedicated to researching, reporting, and storytelling around the data and science of our changing climate. At Climate Central, we develop and distribute broadcast and publish-ready content that is ready for you to tell your climate stories, helping to empower your forecasts, the stories, and the content that you make to bridge those critical links between extreme weather events and human-caused climate change to your audiences, to your readers, and to your followers.
Thank you, Shel. And once again, thank you all for joining our third Prep Your Climate Coverage webinar. This is a seasonal series that we do here at Covering Climate Now in conjunction with Climate Central that is dedicated to providing resources and accessible language that you can use when covering the upcoming season's anticipated climate-driven extreme weather events. Often we see that climate coverage is reactionary, with journalists and newsrooms scrambling for relevant research or climate information in the aftermath of an extreme weather event, and oftentimes gets left on the wayside because so often we're trying to cover stories of recovery and stories of the immediate aftermath and often don't have time to do so. The goal for these sessions is to get ahead of this and to be ready with the climate confidence and the resources to quickly and effectively make your climate connection while reporting. We're going to have plenty of time at the very end for questions, so go ahead and submit yours using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Be sure to include your name as well as the name of your news outlet or location. We're going to read them out for the panelists to answer at the top of the hour. And while this webinar is open to everyone, we ask that we're only taking questions from working journalists and meteorologists and newsrooms only. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce some of the panelists that we have here today that are going to help Shel and I. We'll kick it off with Adam Mahoney, who is the National Climate and Environment Reporter at Capital B, where he covers how climate change disproportionately affects Black communities across the United States, especially in the South. Awarded CC Now's Emerging Journalist of the Year last year in 2024, Adam's work explores the intersection of climate change with other issues weighing on those communities, such as housing, employment access, criminal justice, and mental health. Join me in welcoming Adam to this webinar. We also have Caitlin Trudeau as Senior Research Associate for Climate Science at the nonprofit Climate Central. Based in Sacramento, she leads the organization's fire weather research and analysis of West Coast climate impacts. Once again, please join me in giving all of our colleagues a warm virtual welcome. All right, we're going to go ahead and jump right into this because we have a lot to cover for today. While most of the session is going to be exploring how climate change has influenced fall weather and wildfire season, we'd be remiss to not talk about and not first acknowledge the Atlantic hurricane season, which is heating up pretty fast. Yes, I know it's true. We've only had one hurricane so far this season with Aaron, but we are now heading into the peak of hurricane season with Gabrielle likely to form later this week with more storms likely on the way over the next 2 months. Given that, I want to take just a moment or so to bring you all up to speed with some practical tools and tips in case you missed our hurricane-focused webinar earlier this year. And first, we really just have to talk about Aaron. because just a few weeks ago, Aaron became the fastest intensifying hurricane, or rather, one of the fastest intensifying hurricanes in recorded history, going from a Category 1 storm with just winds of around 75 miles per hour to a Category 5 storm with near 160 mile per hour winds in just 18 hours, less than a day. Thankfully, this storm did stay well enough offshore, which drastically reduced its potential impacts, but this rapid intensification that we saw with Aaron is not an anomaly. A study posted to nature.com found that roughly 80% of major hurricanes, that's Category 3 and above, undergo rapid intensification at some point during their life cycle. Additional research also shows that since 1979, human-caused warming has increased the global likelihood of a tropical cyclone developing into a major hurricane by about 5% per decade. I want to pass it over to Shell to further dive into this and also show with you all a really cool free tool that you can use to quantify climate change's influence on the unusually warm water which fuels these storms.
Yeah, and I think what's, we all saw with Aaron was just not only how fast it intensified there as it moved its way past the east side of the Caribbean and then up to the north, but just a massive scale. I likened it to something that built up really fast, and then once it started weakening a bit, all of its groceries, like if you tripped over a rock, all of its groceries just kind of spilled out. So let's put some science to it, right? So here's what we know about Aaron. The storm passed over excessively warm ocean waters that were running about 2 degrees Fahrenheit above average for mid-August. And as we put attribution science to work, an analysis that Climate Central's Climate Shift Index shows was that this level of warming was up to 100 times more likely due to human-caused climate change. So what that means is that very excessive warmth, even in mid-August, as we're starting to approach the peak of hurricane season, that was still something that was well above what was typical for that time of the year. And we can quantify that to understand climate change's role, making it at least 100 times more likely to be that hot in that part of the Atlantic at that time of the year. So what we can do now is actually take that attribution science further and understand the human-induced ocean warming that in turn cranked up Aaron's peak intensity to 9 miles per hour, pushing a storm that would have been a Category 4, a 151 mile per hour storm, into a Category 5, which is what we saw when it peaked at 160 miles per hour. To say it simply, if not for human-caused climate change, Aaron would have been a Category 4 storm at its peak. Now, new this season, you can track this intensity and this attribution science in real time as hurricanes are forecast and then reach that lifetime maximum intensity. There's a link in the chat to the Hurricane and Aaron analysis. That same tool will be available for future storms, no matter if they make landfall or they stay over the open waters or a fish storm. You'll be able to use this attribution science and see if there was a wind speed increase, but also if there's a category shift that's attributable to human-caused climate change. One thing you can also do in the data that you're seeing there, this is the Climate Shift Index Ocean. It utilizes NOAA's OISST data to quantify and understand the influence of heat trapping pollution on our sea surface temperatures. And one big takeaway that you'll notice from this graphic is that big gray area. So not only does it show us temperatures that are more likely because of climate change and future warming, but it also shows us where temperatures are cooler than average and might be less likely in a warmer world. And what this data shows us is that it now takes massive systems like Aaron to temporarily cool the ocean. Sea surface temperatures in Aaron's wake have been up to 200 times less likely to run 3 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit below average in late August in a warmer world due to heat trapping pollution. So as always with these Prep Your Climate coverage sessions, we want to provide you with scientifically backed language that you can use in your reporting, in your forecasting to quickly make the climate connection. So language that you can use for hurricane specific. The science and research is clear that climate change supercharges hurricanes, increasing their intensity, their rainfall, and their storm surge.
Thanks for that, Shell. I mean, just to see the upwelling after that storm using that CSI Ocean is fascinating stuff. We know of this as meteorologists that cooler water gets sucked up in these storms and leaves a bit of a cool spell in its wake. But to see that it in the data. Really fascinating stuff. And it's going to be an invaluable tool also to quantify climate change in a way that makes our audiences better to understand and can see. Speaking as a scientist, I know that we love our stats, but it's only a part of the story, as hurricanes are more than just wind speeds and intensity numbers. They're disasters with long-lived, life-changing consequences. I want to go ahead and bring in Adam Mahoney to briefly chat about this. Adam, you're currently based in New Orleans and have been chronicling the 20th anniversary of Katrina over these past couple of months. We know that the wounds from this disaster still cut deep, even decades later today. For those in areas that are still recovering from some of the more recent devastating storms, such as Helene in the Carolinas or even Maria in Puerto Rico, what advice do you have for reporters covering these communities, especially when it comes to displacement as well as those long-term impacts?
Yeah, that's a great question, David. Thank you for that. I think the first or my first simple advice would really be to remember what the goal of our journalism is, right? Finding that balance between telling the news and also making sure that the work we're doing is ultimately improving people's lives. So that means prioritizing the actual voices of residents and making sure that their experiences, their names are kind of front and center in that coverage. There's a way to combine the very important high level statistics and conversations and government rhetoric with the actual lived experiences of folks. And I think Katrina really shows how important that is, right? Because we've seen it's been 20 years, it's 2 decades later, and pretty much every facet of life in New Orleans and across, the most impacted places of the Gulf South because of that storm are still reeling and feeling those impacts. So, a lot of that looks like, at least in my coverage, trying to make the connections between climate change and the increased severity of these storms with kind of the, pulling out of a lot of our safety net at the federal and state level, and seeing how that also means in the aftermath of these storms, we're seeing the erosion of opportunity, gaps in healthcare access, and increased mental health challenges. And I think it's really important also to note that, we're seeing the decimation of communities, and that does have immediate economic and social impacts, but it also has generational impacts when we think about displacement, gentrification, community loss. So the most recent story I did tied to the anniversary of Katrina was focused on the fact that 2 decades after the storm, Louisiana actually is the most vulnerable state in the country for what we call deaths of despair. So they're deaths related to poverty and helplessness. So things like addiction, suicide, and chronic illnesses. And talking to residents, a lot of the mental health struggles that have come up in the aftermath of the storm and still exist today. I mean, they're both a product of living through the devastation, living through the flooding experiences, and the trauma of seeing their neighbors perish in the storm, but also then that constant remembering of what has been lost. So I talked to a resident who now in the lower Ninth Ward, which is kind of the poster child for the devastation of that storm, he lives on a street where there are only 3 homes left. And 2 decades ago, there were 24 houses on that block. So I think as journalists, we have to figure out a way to kind of bridge the gap between the important scientific rhetoric with the actual lived experiences. Because a lot of folks, I mean, at least for me, covering, Gulf South states, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, those are 3 of the 5 poorest states in the country. They don't really have a trust in the media ecosystem for various reasons. So meeting people where they're at is really, really important in doing this work.
Absolutely. And we're going to come back to that because just as Katrina reshaped New Orleans, we saw this with also recent wildfires, how it underscores how climate disasters not only completely change the landscape of the area, but also deepen generational inequalities. I just want to highlight once again, we have plenty of time at the end for our panelists to answer your questions. So continue to use that Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. All right, let's go ahead and move on to one of Autumn's biggest impacts, especially out in the West, and that is wildfires. We know that the 2025 season started early, with devastating fires in and around Los Angeles becoming one of the costliest climate disasters ever. And it's not just here in North America. The EU is having its worst year for wildfires in recorded history, with fires engulfing 4 times as much land this year compared to the seasonal average, with weeks of dangerous fire weather still yet to come, both there as well as here in the US, with recent forecasts suggesting that this year's season is actually going to linger longer into fall than usual. In some ways, we have seen that wildfire season isn't really a season anymore, but rather a year-long concern for many communities. And we're seeing this with a recent Climate Central analysis showing that wildfire season is not only starting earlier and ending later, but also growing more intense, especially across the West. When we say, by the way, and you can see that here, fire weather days, we're talking about the combination of low humidity, high heat, and strong winds. These don't guarantee that a fire is going to ignite, but they create those conditions where, given an ignition source, a fire is far more likely to start and spread quickly. By the way, if you happen to be in any of these areas highlighted, understand that the trend graphics for these over 240 locations over the past 50 years are available via the link that my colleague Elena just put in the chat. These are ready for you to use in your stories, in your articles, social media, or if any of you are broadcast available to use on air. We also understand that the data shows that the continental United States is now around 2.5 degrees warmer than it was in 1970. That extra heat is reshaping fire weather nationwide. And we can see this, especially out in the West. Fire weather has increased the most. On average, regions there see around a month or 31 days of fire weather a year, nearly 4 times more than the East, which happens to average right around 8 days. But even in the East, where I'm located in North Carolina, overall changes have been modest, mainly because it is pretty humid here, and that humid heat tends to limit extremely dry days. But still, some regions are seeing a noticeable increase, such as the northern Piedmont of North Carolina, which now averages nearly 2 more weeks of fire weather annually. We're also seeing this in areas which saw wildfires last year up in New England, including northern New Jersey and coastal New York, which now see at least 10 more extra days per year compared to half a century ago. In terms of leading the nation, though, that goes to Nevada and New Mexico with 76 and 74 fire weather days annually. In some places like Southern California, New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona, they've also seen some of these biggest increases, with certain areas now experiencing 2 additional months of fire weather each year compared to just half a century ago. And we know that nowhere is truly safe from the impacts of climate change. There's this concept of climate haven is kind of rooted in some wrong thinking, because even if the fires aren't burning in your backyard, we know that the impacts of wildfires don't just stop at where it's burning. It crosses over state and county borders. Wildfire smoke pollution has surged in recent years, something that many of you have probably reported on or had even seen personally, including the influences to air quality this past summer, as smoke from Canadian wildfires traveled hundreds, even thousands of miles into the United States, once again showing that even if the fires aren't raging in your communities, you all are likely still seeing the impacts of climate change. In fact, between 2000 and 2004, per person smoke exposure was 4 times higher than it was just over a decade ago, from 2006 to 2019. In fact, over the last decade, the rise in wildfire smoke has stalled or even reversed decades of air quality improvements that we have seen in over 30 states. Now, it is true, wildfires are complex and they're influenced by a variety of different factors, which we'll talk a little bit about in a moment. But we need to understand that where we build is putting more people in harm's way. Growing communities along the wildland urban interface where homes meet where homes are meeting that flammable landscape such as forest are especially vulnerable. The states with the most residents at risk are, of course, California, Texas, but also North Carolina. We know that climate change is impacting the ingredients that make for explosive fire danger and growth. But again, it's a good note for us to kind of look around and make note that reporting transparency is important, because the actual spark for wildfires is either going to be through natural events such as lightning strikes, but also human activities. But that being said, from 2001 to 2004, around 87% of wildfires were human caused, which accounts for nearly half of all acres burned down during this period. I want to bring in Caitlin Trudeau to touch on this, because I know that wildfires have impacted you and your family personally. And as a wildfire expert, I know you're often asked about the cause of wildfires and if climate change caused it. So the question is, why do you urge reporters to highlight influence and not causality when it comes to talking about climate change's impact on wildfires?
Yeah, that's a great question. The main reason is because I think it's kind of used to distract people from the actual conversation we need to be having. So fire is natural, it's actually an important part of our forest ecosystems. And really, fires would happen with us, without us. That's not really what we're talking about. What we're talking about is that human-caused climate change has really increased the severity of these fires. It allows them to burn hotter, longer, faster, and become much harder to put out. It also makes it harder to do things like prescribed burning, because we can't safely prescribe burn when we have really hot, dry, and windy days. I really urge people not to get distracted by the cause debate, because I think that is a little bit intentional, and it's kind of besides the point. Not that it's not important. It's just, climate change doesn't cause these fires directly, but climate change is directly impacting the way that these fires are burning.
And one way I like to think of this is pretty much everything we do, whether it's a decision about where we're going to get lunch or even just bigger impacts and choices in our life, are very rarely caused by a single thing. Like, again, for lunch, it's like, yeah, I could get pizza, but I had pizza yesterday. And also, I'm trying to eat earlier, but I only have like 10 minutes. So all of those make your final decision of what caused it, it has a hand in play. But just like climate change influences all of that, again, it's important that we don't get bogged down too much in a singular causality. Thanks for that. We're going to have another question for you in just a moment, but I wanted to spotlight a piece from NBC's national climate reporter, Chase Gain, who made this point for our broadcast folks in less than a minute, and you can do the exact same. But he did this while covering the LA wildfires back in January. Let's take a look at it.
Lots of things have to come together to cause massive, devastating wildfires like these. So it's not that climate change causes a fire, but it does allow them to burn much more intensely and spread much more quickly. And that's a painful reality for folks here in Southern California.
I mean, I have family who who asked me, like, so who started the fires? I was like, what are you talking about? This is the climate change as we see it. Like, when we came yesterday, it looked like an inferno in here.
So let's focus on two factors with clear connections to climate change. One, when we burn fossil fuels, it puts greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, making it hotter. And physics tells us that the hotter we make the atmosphere, the more moisture it holds. But it also makes the atmosphere thirstier, quite literally sucking moisture out of plants, grass, brush, anything. That's creating more fuel for these wildfires. And two, climate change is creating more extreme swings between wet and dry.
Yeah, so let's dive into that. And Caitlin, we'll bring you back too. I'm glad that Chase brought up that thirstier atmosphere, right? Because we've talked about it a lot this summer when we've seen flood event after flood event after flood event. We know that the atmosphere can hold more moisture and release more moisture, but one connection to make is that it can also, like Chase said, take more moisture from the ground, from the vegetation. I like to call it a greedier atmosphere. So it means that droughts can become, flash droughts faster, and it's harder to get out of them. So, Caitlin, let's talk about this swing that between the periods of extreme wet and the extreme dry that was mentioned here. We can call it, quote, hydroclimate whiplash. How does this also boost the wildfire risk?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So one of the ways that it does is obviously by making it a lot drier. So we have a thirsty atmosphere, it's sucking a lot of the moisture out of our landscape. It's just making the environment a lot, more flammable, making it easier for fires to burn. But when it takes all that moisture out, we start to see these swings to really heavy downpours. And when we have that, we usually happens when we have a lot of growth and vegetation. And so you have all this vegetation that grows, and then that's followed again by really dry weather that just dries out all the vegetation. And now you have all this basically new kindling just sitting on the landscape and higher fire risk. So it kind of is this like feedback loop where it just gives you more fuel and then it makes things drier. It gives you more fuel and it makes things drier. So these extremes back and forth, really increase the risk of a larger and more dangerous fire.
I want to bring in Adam again to talk about a piece that you published a little bit earlier this year that I personally really enjoyed. In it, you highlighted a family that lost their home in the Eaton fire. In it, you weren't only balancing both their story of grief and also small moments of joy, but you were also able to paint a larger picture of systemic problems, especially faced by Black disaster survivors. I want you to talk a little bit about that, but especially tell us about how you first heard about the Joneses story. And do you have any advice for journalists who want to try to find and also tell survivor stories in a meaningful but also a respectful way?
Yeah. So I'll take the second part of that question first. I mean, so in terms of the Jones family, and specifically, one of the interesting things, I was not in Los Angeles when the wildfires broke out. So that was like a big challenge for us as a newsroom, is finding out the best way to reach folks immediately after the wildfires broke out without being too intrusive and not necessarily actually taking into account the deep trauma that they were going through. So I did find the Jones family first through social media. I reached out and I kind of had a plan for everybody that I was reaching out to at the time, just letting them know that ultimately, one, they had the complete right not to talk to me, not to speak with me. But if they did, I would, try my best to hold their story as best as possible. And also, one of the important things about our coverage, we were, trying to connect folks with resources too at the time. There was a massive GoFundMe push. There was a lot of money being made quickly available through nonprofits at the time, and then trying to get people into that pathway as quickly and as efficiently as possible. But I think one of the things that made this story possible, the first time I talked to them was in January. That story did not come out until April. We had a relationship over those 4 months. I was checking in every week after the first time that we reached out just to see where they were, how things were going. They didn't respond every week, but just to make sure that they knew that I was there to hear their story if they wanted to share it. And I think when we're handling such a traumatic experience for folks, we have to remember kind of some of the social and cultural and emotional things that are like undergirding their experiences too. So, I mean, in the case of the Jones family specifically, and a lot of the families in Altadena, specifically the Black and Latino families, like those are homes that have been in folks' lives for generations. So it's a difference between just losing kind of the physical home and maybe the economic security of that place, but also the memories that those spaces hold, especially for a city like Los Angeles, where redlining was rampant, and for generations, Black and Latino folks actually didn't have access to home ownership in the same way. So like I can give an example, at least for that piece. Once I did finally make it to LA, I didn't meet them in Altadena at the site of their destroyed home. We met outside at a restaurant. We talked for a couple of hours. And I also made it clear that like I did want to go see their property, but they didn't have to come. They didn't have to join me if they didn't want to rehash that trauma. And I think that's really important for us to build rapport and trust in folks. And I think it's also really important to make sure that when we're talking to sources, that they understand kind of the implications of sharing their stories with news sources, whether that be like, a lot of folks had things to say about FEMA and their insurance companies and what that might mean, in terms of not necessarily retaliation, but just making those relationships more uncomfortable once they do have to, have conversations with their insurance brokers and whatnot. So yeah, I think really the key thing for a lot of these issues is to make sure that we're doing the research beforehand, to understand the actual issues and systemic issues undergirding these problems, and then they come through very clearly. So like in that story, Mr. Jones made the comment, he wasn't necessarily someone that believed in climate change before the wildfires, or didn't think that a climate event would impact him. But the one climate event that he could always connect back to, and that was always in the back of his mind, was Hurricane Katrina, right? And because that was a very specific event that had specific impacts on Black folks that looked like him. And after this event, he, said that now he realizes that everyone is ultimately going to have like what he called their Katrina moment. So we can make these connections to the bigger systemic issues, the issues of climate change, the issues of, maybe FEMA not necessarily supporting victims in the way that they want to be supported, our insurance crisis, all of those things in a way that's like tangible for people. But to do that first, we have to actually have the relationships with the sources, and that takes time. And that goes back to the point of like, we're balancing getting the news out there to the world with also balancing the needs of survivors and victims of these disasters.
Really great tips there. And I think you hit it exactly nail on the head of, often as reporters, as newsrooms, we are talking and interacting with these folks on probably the worst day of their lives, when it comes to these climate disasters. And for us to be human and to have a relationship goes a long way. And I think, and you touched on it a little bit, to have continuing relationship with these sources, because I'm sure you're learning more, especially in those couple of months, as they continue to navigate, and more stories will come out from that. But also, it's not a good look for us to be there and have these survivors lay their hearts bare, but only to be ghosted once the story essentially airs. Let's move on really quickly. And again, I see a few great questions in the chat. If you could just be sure to include your name and the outlet that you work with, just so that we are aware of that. So as always, again, with these sessions, we want to provide you with language that you can confidently use, that is scientifically backed. And if you're even just talking about a story about wildfires, you can quickly throw this into your story to make that climate connection. And this is done in conjunction with Climate Central and us at Covering Climate Now, but also other organizations such as World Weather Attribution. Highly encourage you to check out their work, because they offer a lot of resources and language for reporters as well. So here it is. Heat trapping pollution is driving hotter, drier conditions that create more days with wildfire risk and worsen the health burdens associated with wildfire smoke. Now, before we move on to the last big section that we're going to be talking about, and that is mainly about fall weather. We've talked about hurricanes, we've talked about wildfires, which happen again during the fall. And before we go into fall weather, we have to quickly review the difference between climate and weather. To the meteorologists in the room and the climate reporters, this may seem obvious, but for a lot of folks, it isn't, especially in your audience, and especially in a season like fall that's marked by big temperature swings, because this misunderstanding is often used as an excuse to discredit climate science, because whenever it gets unseasonably cold after a cold front, or we're seeing it right now throughout most of the eastern coast, the "what happened to global warming" comments are sure to follow. So in a nutshell, weather refers to the atmospheric conditions that exist at a given place in a given time. So we're talking about weather when we say it's really nice today, temperatures in the 70s, or it was raining yesterday, while climate is the long-term pattern in weather conditions over time. We're talking about climate when we say that Texas is usually hot in July. One analogy that I like to use is weather tells you what clothes you should be wearing today, while climate tells you what clothes you should have in your closet. Another one that I like is weather is your emotions, while climate is your personality. Again, while much of what we're talking about today is weather, extreme weather events, and changing temperatures, there is a climate connection because, again, the intensity, the frequency, and even spatial trends of our weather are changing. And it's not just for climate disasters, as we've already discussed. Our everyday autumn weather is changing, leading to cascading effects. Over to you, Shel.
David, I have a quick question for you.
Yeah.
What kind of shoes are you wearing right now? Are they Uggs? Are you ready for fall?
I am not. I'm wearing boots, but they are not Uggs.
Okay, you're
Not
getting
yet.
close. Yeah. So it is the time of the year. Grab your pumpkin spice latte if you've got it next to you. The boots with the fur, apple bottom jeans, pumpkin patches, all those good stuff. We're ready for fall. I've already been to Lowe's and seen the giant displays that I've tried to convince my wife to buy, right? So we're ready. Meteorological fall kicked off on Monday, on September 1st. And while this is the time that we're starting to think about all the fall fun, as much as we're thinking about things like Taylor and Travis's upcoming nuptials, right? Like the season of fall, though, overall has warmed in every single county in the lower 48 since 1970. I'll say that one more time. The season of fall in every single county in the United States in the lower 48 has experienced some sort of warming between September, October, and November in just the past 50 to 55 years. The fastest warming for fall is in the Southwest, where average fall temperatures are now 4 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than they were just about 50 to 55 years ago. And across 237 cities that in the US, fall has warmed on average by 2.8 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the big number for the US. But we know, again, that is averaged out across the entire US. Unusually warm days now happen more often in 98% of these 237 cities that Climate Central analyzed. And almost half of these cities, 119 of them, now experience at least 2 weeks more worth of above average days than our parents and our grandparents got to enjoy apple cider to back in the 1970s. What this tells us is that we're seeing more of our season, which, yes, we'll have below average days. Yes, we'll have some above average days as the seasons fight it out, but we're seeing more of these above average days as we continue to go forward and as climate change really begins to continue to show us what humans have done to the atmosphere. So this trend map closely matches what NOAA's Climate Prediction Center expects for this fall. This is their outlook showing above average temperatures are expected across much of the country as the summer heat creeps and starts to linger into this fall season. Of course, it doesn't just influence our Instagram pictures of leaves and pumpkin patches, but it prolongs the health risks from the heat. It extends wildfire seasons like we've talked about earlier. It worsens allergies because the growing season is longer. We've got a longer stretch between the last freeze and the first freeze. And it lengthens the seasons of biting pests that are pesky, like mosquitoes and ticks that also come with health impact. Now, if we drill down to the city level, the top 5 fall warming locations are, and if you've followed all the resources and the seasonal package that Climate Central has put out, the number 1 city won't surprise you because it is typically right there at number 1. But number 1 is Reno, Nevada, at an ice latte melting 7.7 degrees Fahrenheit of warming in just the past 50 years. That's followed by El Paso and Las Vegas with over 6 degrees of warming in the fall season. Then Tyler, Texas, and Tucson, Arizona, one and the same when it comes to their trend at 5.8 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, one thing that comes with fall, when being a meteorologist here in Texas and in the South, this was very common for us. It also means second severe weather season. One way to visualize the secondary season is becoming more active is by measuring the fuel for thunderstorms, called CAPE. So for meteorologists, this is something that we know. For the journalists in the room, if you're unfamiliar, what CAPE stands for is convective available potential energy. Basically, it is the juice that gets thunderstorms going and allows them potentially to do what they do and maybe even become severe. When CAPE values rise above 1,000, the atmosphere has enough instability to support storms. Data shows that a subtle increase in these high CAPE days across much of the northern and eastern US, with the largest increases in the deep south, especially Mississippi and Alabama. Something to monitor as cold fronts collide with climate change boosted heat, unstable air, and extra moisture from a warmer than usual Gulf of Mexico, which we can also utilize as we're using our forecasts that climate shift index ocean. It can help us understand how much warmer our moisture supply is, and that allows more evaporation into the air. This also sets the stage for stronger severe weather, especially damaging straight line wind events, the most common storm hazard in the United States. Research finds that in the central US, straight line wind thunderstorms have intensified 7% for every 1 degree Fahrenheit of warming between 1980 and 2020. There is a lot there. There's a lot to unpack when it comes to fall. Again, this is the time of the year where the seasons, they're fighting it out. Summertime's still trying to stay with us. Winter's trying to give us a little boost of that cool, crisp feeling. There's tons of story ideas out there that have a climate connection that go back to these shifting temperature trends and go well beyond the changing fall foliage. Not to say that that's not a great story and that it's very engaging for our viewers and our readers, but there's more to talk about, right? We encourage you to talk to local gardeners or fruit and flower producers. What have they noticed and what has changed for them? Certain plants that are struggling to thrive in your location that maybe grandma or someone who's been there for a very long time has always relied on or always planted at this time of the year that just can't do it anymore because of our changing climate. And for new plants arriving due to warmer weather, attribution science such as climate shift index, the Climate Central's Climate Shift Index tool, it helps frame the lingering effects of these warmer temperatures, even if it's a welcome change with the fingerprints of climate change. For our broadcast meteorologists, you're happy to know that this is available in KML format to bring in either to your Mac system or your Barron system or your organization's GIS graphic system if you're a digital reporter. They can be useful on severe weather days. It could be useful for unlikely warmth. It doesn't just have to be record-breaking warmth. It could just be a day where you walk outside and you say, well, this doesn't quite feel like a September afternoon, right? We can understand how much more likely a warmer than average temperature is due to climate change and how the days leading up to maybe severe weather season or a severe weather event are enhanced because of these higher risks. So like we've done already with wildfires and with hurricanes, let's give you something that you can take in right now and you can drop into any of your articles you're reporting. So language that you can use that ties the climate connection to a warmer fall season. Autumn, like all season, is warming across the US, driven by carbon pollution that traps heat in the atmosphere. As that warmth lingers longer into the season, wildfire risks grow, allergies worsen, and agriculture faces increased new challenges.
All right. That was a lot that we covered in just the past 45 minutes. Everything from hurricanes, wildfires, and even threw in some pumpkin spice lattes. I have yet to have mine for the season yet. I think it's still a little bit too warm. Don't worry if you didn't take notes, which we probably should have told you at the beginning not to, because we have all of this stats in specific language from us at Covering Climate Now and Climate Central on our website, along with tons of other resources and guides to help your coverage, but also to expand your climate knowledge. For these last 15 minutes, I want to get to some questions from a few of you. Continue to post in the chat or the Q&A function any questions that you might have. I want to get to a few that we got, though, in the registration link. And Adam, we had a few questions about home insurance and foreclosures after climate disasters, including hurricanes and wildfires. You reported on this topic actually fairly recently, highlighting a recent study from First Street, which I found the stats in there surprising and frightening, which they predicted that foreclosures across the United States caused by weather-related incidents are expected to soar by 380% over the next decade. What did you find was driving this? Was it rising insurance rates, a steep financial climb to rebuild, or kind of all of the above?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely say it's all of the above. I can just use Altadena as an example. In the LA wildfires. So I just recently did a story about, there's dozens of homes already in the burn zone that are at risk of foreclosure and on pre-foreclosure lists, which just basically means your lender has formally told you that your home is at risk of foreclosure. And the folks that I talked to that were on the list, so it's a mix of, either if you weren't one of the lucky ones to, maybe have that home in your family for generations and you're still on a mortgage, the biggest issue is, after disasters, and let's say your house is burned down and it's a burnt lot, you're still paying a mortgage on that property while you're paying for a new lease or a new rental somewhere else, on top of probably also experiencing some job loss or some job precarity. So when you combine all of these things and then you tie in rising property insurance rates if you still are under insurance of your insurance broker, on top of rising property taxes in a lot of these places, it's just kind of created this perfect economic storm. And we've seen that there are gaps in terms of the amount of support folks are getting from both their insurance companies on top of FEMA. And then I think another tricky situation is that when you also think of who owns homes in this country, right now it is folks 50 and above are the vast majority of homeowners. That means you're either already retired, living on a fixed income, or you're pushing retirement age. So I'm also working on a story that'll come out in a couple of weeks about the fact that early hardship withdrawals from retirement funds are on the rise because of climate disasters. So that means people are pulling out of their, private retirement funds, their 401ks, and even their public pensions to cover some of these costs, whether that be, the rebuilding costs or the costs for a new lease and rental. And I think, talking to researchers, this is something that is only going to become more common if that safety net is not bolstered, because we already know low-income renters are already at the bottom of the barrel in terms of support, but you would typically think that your homeowners, your folks middle class and above, actually have the financial resources and the kind of ability to navigate through maybe the bureaucratic the hurdles at a different rate. But in reality, it is just as difficult as an experience for folks, even if they are salaried, middle class, and quote unquote homeowners. So that is something that, particularly along the Gulf South, when we're thinking about hurricanes and the East Coast, and then on the West Coast with wildfires, as insurance pulls out of these places, people are going to have to figure out if they're going to either deplete their savings to recover, or pick up and go and try to find somewhere safer and cheaper. But to your point earlier, there's really no such thing as a climate haven. So this does seem like an issue that is only going to get worse.
It absolutely is. And we've done a dedicated webinar that we published earlier this year about the home insurance crisis that is looming as a direct result of climate change. You can check that out if my colleague Elena would find that. I believe we had that earlier in the year on February. I have another question both in the chat. I see Glenda posted that, but also someone else in the RSVP that is asking about federal agency data, because this is a huge issue that we have seen over the past 7 or 8 months and likely going to continue. So I'm going to just flag it for anyone to really chime in, but I really liked what Zachary from WFAE said about a specific resource, and I want to just open it up to the floor if anyone's aware of that. Are there any resources for calculating individual state costs of weather disasters over time?
Yeah, I think the closest that would be the $1 billion disasters, but that's only the large ones. And yeah, I can't think of any other like state specific cost ones. I know that NOAA also does have they have storm estimates for wind damage. I've seen some different sites that have those for specific wind events. They have costs related to those things, but those are the only ones I've heard of.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a tricky question. I think we're all trying to kind of navigate it, because even the $1 billion disaster website, unfortunately, which has been going for over a decade now, at least on the .gov site, is not going to be updated for 2025.
Yeah. And one great tip that we got from our last Prep Your Coverage update was, when a big storm comes through or there is a disaster, there are state requests for, funds from the government, or there are disaster declarations that are issued by county commissioners or maybe even governors, right? So that may be a way to get in at a local level to understand what that economic disaster might look like, um, even without the federal data that we've come to know.
I have a question from Zachary Turner. I'll probably take some of it, and then anyone else feel to chime in. From WFAE in Charlotte, North Carolina, just down the road from me in Raleigh. We understand that North Carolina has warmed less than the national average, since we were already kind of hot and humid. So how has climate change changed the state's fall experience for the average North Carolinian? I think Shell provided a lot of different great story ideas, really talking to fruit and flower producers, because those especially have changed in the fall season. I also encourage you to potentially check out how tourism also is changing in some of these areas, because a lot of areas which have apple orchards and typical kind of fall experiences have experienced a bit of a drop off because less people want to go out there when it feels 90, 95 degrees outside. So again, anecdotally, I know that has been an issue, especially in the Southeast, with some of those locally owned or family owned farms. Also really investigate how they are doing with these pest control, because a lot of these farms do rely on a fairly rigorous frost and freeze in the season to kill off some of those pests. And now that we are seeing kind of a lingering summer warmth, that definitely may influence how much they're spending on pest control as well. Anything to add, Shell, Caitlin, or Adam on this?
I'll throw a quick thing in and then Caitlin might have more to add. But I was looking, yeah. So I was actually diving into the Charlotte data this morning. I was talking some Panther football, and the average fall temperature has warmed 1.8 degrees for Charlotte specifically. When you break that up, though, that's average, right? That's highs and that is lows. So when you break that up and you look at just high temperatures, what's the average high temperature trend over the past 50 years in Charlotte? You've warmed 3.3 degrees. But when you look at the minimum temperatures, I think this is where it's interesting, is that minimum temperatures actually come down. So it's actually much lower. And in some cases, it may even be a little cooler than it was just 50 years ago. So there's a big back and forth there, right? We talked about whiplash. And I think that goes to show, and Caitlin, you can add to this as well. We can still have some cold outbursts, especially in the fall season, but the overall trend in the weather that most of us are spending our days in, getting out to do activities in, it's still those warmer than average afternoons and daytimes.
Yeah, I was gonna say minimum temperatures as well, just checking those. I think that's forgotten for a lot of people forget about the minimum temperatures, and maybe not so much in North Carolina, but when they are, a lot of places are seeing a lot of warming, and there's a lot of health implications for that kind of go under the radar. But then, yeah, I mean, when you have growing seasons that are expanding, and agriculture impacts, different agriculture needs different, number of chill hours, ultimate kind of things like that, agriculture and crops.
So plenty of different story ideas that go beyond just falling leaves and changing leaf colors. Jesse, I put a question in the chat for you, Shell, about where you get that data and where you can find it for other cities. I'm sure it's all on Climate Central's website. If you wouldn't mind just putting it in the chat.
Sure can do.
Fantastic. Adam, I want to talk a little bit about covering these climate disasters, because you grew up in LA and now in New Orleans. You've at least been in the forefront of seeing how these communities have fared, and seeing how journalists kind of come in and then leave. What have you noticed in terms of whenever there's a climate disaster, it seems to have a huge focus on the region for about a month or so, and then I don't want to say people forget about it, but in some cases, like I know from personal experience, the upstate of North Carolina and South Carolina with Helene, people are asking, well, what about us? Have you noticed that too much? And what advice would you give to journalists so that these communities don't feel left out?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that's a very fair reading of it all. I mean, I think one of the interesting things, I would actually argue that like the LA wildfires have been a model of kind of better national coverage, but I think it's also the fact that it was mainly wealthier homeowners that got impacted by the wildfires and what that means versus, to your point, Western North Carolina, where a more rural area, higher instances of poverty and what that coverage can and should look like. I mean, it all kind of goes back to the point I was making earlier about we just need to maintain relationships with folks, especially if you are, I'm a national reporter, so I can't always be everywhere all the time. But we do have a computer in our hands basically 24/7 with our phones, and we have the ability to connect with folks. So I think maintaining that relationship and remembering that, like, or at least trying our best not to be extractive in terms of just getting maybe these stories or these instances of systemic injustices and then broadcasting them out without any kind of reciprocal relationship where our sources can also be like, or we're accountable to the people that we're, reporting on and with. And a lot of that has to do with, also like I mentioned earlier, at least attempting to connect folks with resources as you're doing this reporting, making sure that you have kind of an open line if folks ever want to reach out to you, and really building that relationship, which once again is also difficult if you're doing that with 24 people all at the same time. But I think a lot of it is just attempting our best to be accountable to the communities that we're reporting on. And also understanding, at least as a national reporter, there are like folks on the ground. There are local reporters doing this work every single day, and doing our best maybe to either uplift their work instead of, doing what typically a lot of our mainstream traditional outlets of the world do, and kind of stealing folks' work without credit, just to broadcast it to a national audience. So at the same time, yeah, building that rapport with local reporters, I think is really helpful, especially if you're at the national level.
We are just about out of time, but I want to give just a minute or two for you, Caitlin. Any last minute advice for journalists in these wildfire prone areas, including not just in the West, advice or last things to keep in mind when covering these wildfires as we head into the fall season?
Yeah, I'd say one of the most underused but kind of best fire resources is wildfire risk to communities, wildfirerisk.org. It's a US Forest Service site where you can type in any county, any city, any state, and look at the fire risk for your specific area. You can look at vulnerable communities in your area, and they also give you solutions based on whether you're a homeowner, whether you are a city councilor, whether you are a first responder. They give you all these really tangible, awesome tips for what you can do in your communities, and it just gives you really great information. Homes at risk, fire burn and fire probability, just a lot of stuff that I think people don't realize is out there at such a local scale. So I'd really encourage people to look at that. And yeah, I mean, we're seeing fires a lot more in the fall and even in the winter now. So just definitely keep an eye out, and please reach out if you guys ever have any questions. Or you need help with looking for any fire specific material.
And on that note, I want to both flag my email as well as Shell's email. We can put that in the chat, but I think it's just David at coveringclimatenow.org, and I think it's swinkley at climatecentral.org. So feel free to reach out to us if you have any follow-up questions or need help locating any resources, or even just want to chat about what's going on this fall and need some information. That's just about all the time we have for today. I want to personally thank all of our wonderful panelists. Use that react button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Give them a round of applause, as they were fantastic. I found it very insightful, and I hope you all have as well. I urge you to sign up for both Covering Climate Now and Climate Central's newsletters, which my colleague Elena has put in the chat, so you can continue to stay informed. I will also flag, if you are a journalist and wanting to learn more and keep up and build your knowledge, we do have some trainings available at Covering Climate Now's website. You can explore that and apply for some of those training programs. We'll hope that you join us again for our final Prep Your Climate coverage session of the year. It's going to be coming up likely in November. This one is going to be focused on the impacts of climate change is having on our winter weather. So everything from cold snaps to snowfall patterns and water scarcity, because that's a big part of that as well. So keep an eye out for updates and an invite coming again later on in November. Until then, thank you all and stay in touch. Have a good one.